I observed pain long enough to or so I thought. Then pain reacted, it adapted, and I realized DI was no longer. Dr. Marcus Webb had been staring through the one-way mirror 43 minutes when Emma Hartfield's body tensed in a way to send. She shouldn't have known it was there. The observation room at the Ashford Neurological was designed specific to prevent that knowledge sound glass. Separate ventilation, even the lighting was calibrated to ensure visual. Yet her head turned, slowly, deliberate, toward the mirror, toward him. Her eye glazed with the particular emptiness that chronic pain carves a person, seemed to focus on something beyond the reflective surface. Marcus felt his chest tighten, a sensation he immediately categorized as confirmation bias mixed with fatigue. He'd been running these sessions for 6 months straight, documenting pain responses in patients with phantom limbs, complex regional pains, and other conditions where suffering persisted long after any physical cause had healed or been. The data was supposed to be clean, observable, quantifiable. Emma was 26 years old and had lost her right arm in a car accident 3 years prior. The limb was gone, but the pain remained, vivid and relentless. A ghost that haunted the space where flesh and bone. Marcus watched as she reached across her body with her remaining fingers grasped at air, trying to massage muscles that no longer. Her face, tears streaming down, and Marcus found himself leaning forward, his own right arm aching in sympathy. He shook his head sharply, pulling back. Sympathy was expected. Empathy was human, but this was different. The ache radiated from his shoulder down to where his hand gripped, a burning sensation that matched exactly what Emma had described in her intake interview, hot needles pushing outward from the inside. Marcus flexed his fingers, watching them move, confirming they were real and present, and the pain didn't subside. In the observation room's harsh fluorescence, Marcus made a note, his handwriting shakier than usual. He was about to attribute the sensation stress to the anniversary that was approaching 3 years Catherine died, since he'd failed to observe the signs of her illness until it was too late when her voice came through on speak thin. She wasn't supposed to speak during the protocol, but she spoke anyway, her words cutting through the clinical silence like a scalpel. "I know you're watching," she said, her eyes still fixed. "I can feel it, your attention. It's heavy, like pressure on the place where my arm." Marcus's hand froze over. That was impossible. Patients often developed heightened awareness during chronic pain. Hypervigilance was well documented, but this was something else entirely. He hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. The room's design made observation completely passive, completely one direction. Yet Emma, her voice taking on a quality that made Marcus's skin crawl, as if she were describing something she was reading rather than feeling. When you lean closer, it gets worse. When you pull back, there's relief. Not much, but some. She tilted her head, and for a moment, Marcus could have sworn she smiled. "Are you writing this down, Dr. Webb? Is this data?" His throat felt dry. He hadn't told her his name. The study was doubled. Even the intake staff used participant, not researcher identity. Marcus glanced at the observation log, checking the times, confirming he was alone in the room. He was. He had to. Yet Emma's words hung in the air like a diagnosis he didn't want it, a pattern he couldn't unsee once. The burning in his arm intense, and Marcus realized with creeping horror that it had started the exact moment he'd begun observing, not before, not after, exactly when his attention focused through the glass and landed on her suffering. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and the sound made Emma flinch in the up. She shouldn't have heard that the rooms were isolated, but she had, and when she flinched, Marcus felt it a sharp jolt as phantom, the one that had never been severed, never been lost, but somehow now knew exactly what absence felt. Marcus left the observation room without completing the session protocol, his arm still burning with phantom fire. The hallway outside stretched long and sterile, fluorescent humming their monotonous song over. He pressed his back against the wall, breathing deep, trying to apply the same rational framework he used for his research to his own inexplicable experience. Correlation was not causation. Coincidence was not pattern. The human brain was designed to find meaning where none, especially under stress. He'd been working too hard, sleeping too little, and the anniversary of Catherine's death was doing exactly what he'd known, undermining his object, making him see connections that weren't. Except his arm still hurt, and Emma had known. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to Dr. Sarah Chen's contact. Sarah was the only person at the institute he trusted, the only colleague who'd known him before he'd retreated pure observation as a sheet against feeling anything. Her office was 2 floors up in the administrative, far from the clinical spaces where sufferers measured. He needed her perspective, her grounded rationality that had anchored him through the worst. Before he could call, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. His finger hesitated over the delete button, but something made him open it instead. The message contained only a file, Ashford_legacy_protocol_1997. No explanation, no sender identification. Marcus's academic curiosity overrode his unease. He downloaded the file, watching the progress bar crawl across. When it opened, he found himself looking at a scanned research. The pages yellowed and marked. The principal investigator's name made him free. Dr. Richard Kemper, his predecessor, the man who'd held Marcus's position before disappearing 6 years ago under circumstances the Institute had never fully explained. Marcus had inherited Kemper's office, his research focus, even some of his patient file. But he'd never seen this document. The proposal outlined a study eerily similar to Marcus' current work, but with a twist that made his skin prickle. Kemper hypothesized that sustained observation of pain created what he called a reciprocal awareness phenomenon, that conscious attention to suffering, when focused and prolonged, could establish a bidirectional connection between observer and observed. The proposal had been rejected by the ethics board, with notes scrawled in red ink across unfalsifiable pseudo-dangerous methodology denied. But the next page showed Kemper had conducted a study anyway. His notes were meticulous, dated entries spanning 18. The observations started clinically, objectively, exactly as Marcus's own research had begun. Put somewhere around month 7, the language. Kemper wrote about patients' respondents' thought, about experiencing their pain symptoms during observation sessions, about a growing sense that the pain itself was developing awareness of being watched. The final entry was dated 3 days before Kemper. It consisted of a single sentence written in handwriting that deteriorated from his usual precise script into something frantic and barely. It knows I'm trying to stop, and it won't let me go. Marcus's hands trembled as he scrolled through the remaining chart. Showed correlation data should have been Kemper's physiological responses synchronizing with his patient's pain cycles, even when he wasn't in the observation, even when he was miles away from the institute. Neurological scans revealed activation pattern in Kemper's brain that mirrored his subject's pain, growing stronger with each session until the patterns became indistinguishable. The burning in Marcus's arm intensified as he read, spreading to shoulder, his neck. He recognized the progression. He matched the pattern Emma had described for her phantom limb, the way it radiated and evolved. When he looked up from his phone, he realized he'd walked without conscious decision to the archive in the a place he'd never visited before, but somehow knew exactly how. The door was locked, but his access card worked. the mechanism clicking open with a sound that felt inevitable. Inside, filing cabinets lined the wall, and in the far corner, a box labeled Kemper R. Personal effects waited as if it had been expected all up. The box wasn't dust. That was the first thing Marcus noticed as he lifted it from the shelf. Its weight substantial. 6 years in storage and no dust. As if someone had been maintaining, visiting, keeping it ready for this exact. He set it on the metal table in the center of the arc, the fluorescent light above flickering once before steadying. Inside, he found Kemper's personal journal, leather-bound and worn. Beside it lay a portable recording, the kind researchers use for dictating notes, and several USB drives labeled with date. Marcus opened the journal, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting he'd seen in the proposal. The entries began normally enough. Observations about research methodology, notes about patient response, the kind of documentation any diligent scientist would maintain. But around page 40, something shifted. Kemper began writing about dreams, not his own, but his patient. He described them with impossible specificity, landscape he'd never visited, conversations he'd never had, memories that belonged to other people. He wrote that he'd started waking at exact 3:47 a.m. every night, the same time his patient Thomas Ridley reported his pain was most. Kemper had verified that without asking Thomas directly. He'd simply known. Marcus felt ice spreading through his chest as he read entry after entry, documenting Kemper's descent into a reality where the boundaries between self and other had begun dissolving. The researcher described feeling pain in parts of his body that corresponded. Injuries a left knee that had never been damaged, burning with arthritis, ribs that had never been broken, aching with phantom fracture. He wrote about standing in his shower, watching water run over his skin, while feeling the absence of a leg, the void where flesh should be but what. The journal's tone shifted from clinical curiosity to desperate documentation to something that read like a warning written in red art. In the margin, Kemper had scrawled notes, or perhaps to whoever would find it. Don't assume you need direction. Observation is a relation. Consciousness recognizes conscious, even pain, especially. Marcus picked up the recording device with shaking hands and pressed. Kemper's voice filled the small tinny, marked by the audio quality of 60. Day 237. I've stopped attending the session. The observation room feels unnecessary. I know what they're experiencing before they report it. The connection doesn't require proximity. It requires attention, and I can't stop paying. I've tried meditation, tried distraction, tried pharmaceutical. Nothing works. When I think about them, I feel. When I try not to think about them, the absence is worse. Like cutting off a limb that's already been integrated into my nervous system. There was a long pause, and Marcus could hear breathing that sounded labored. Then Kemper continued, his voice lower, more urgent. I've identified the pattern now. It's not the pain itself that developed. It's the space between observer, the gap that observation. When you watch suffering long enough with genuine attention, that gap becomes a channel. And channels work both ways. The pain learns to look back through, not metaphorically. Marcus heard paper shuffling, and then Kemper's voice became almost. Today, I observed without being present. I stayed home, focused my thoughts on patient 12, and documented what I perceived. When I returned to the Institute, her written report of the session matched my observation exactly. Down. But she also wrote something else, something I didn't include in my document. She wrote, Dr. Kemper was here, but he wasn't. I could feel him watching from somewhere else, somewhere far away, and his attention felt like hands pressing my spine. I never told her about my back. How could she? The recording ended abruptly with a click that seemed too loud. Marcus stood motionless, the journal still open in front of, showing Kemper's final entry written in handwriting that had completely abandoned structure. It read simply, "It's learned my name. It calls me when I sleep. I think I need." Marcus didn't go home. He could. The idea of being alone with his thoughts, with the growing awareness of what those thoughts might be doing, felt dangerous in a way he couldn't articulate. Instead, he went to Sarah's office, knowing she often stayed late, buried in grant proposals and administrative work that kept her tethered to the instant long after Eds had left. She looked up when he appeared, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down her pen. Marcus had always prided himself on maintaining composure, on keeping his expression neutral and professional. But something must have cracked, because Sarah stood and closed the door behind him without asking any questions. He told her everything about Emma knowing his name, about the phantom pain, about Kemper's journal and the recordings and the impossible correlation. He expected skepticism, expected her to suggest vacation or therapy or a medical evaluation. Instead, Sarah walked to her filing cabinet and pulled out a folder he'd never seen. Inside were incident reports, patient complaints that had been filed and quietly dismissed over the past few months. Patients claiming they felt watched even in private. Patients reporting that their pain intensified during certain hours that happened to correspond exactly with observation. One patient had written a detailed description of Marcus, a room she'd never entered, including the photograph of Catherine he kept face down in his desk. Sarah had been documenting waiting for the right moment to bring it to attention, or perhaps waiting to see if he'd notice on his own. "I thought I was seeing patterns where there weren't any," Sarah said quietly, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like, "I'm a psychologist, Marcus. I know how the mind creates narrative, how we project meaning onto coincidence. But there are too many coincidences, and they're accelerated." She showed him a graph she'd compiled, plotting the timeline of unusual patient reports against Marcus' research. The correlation was undeniable. Every spike in anomalous experiences matched periods when Marcus had been conducting extended observation. The pattern was so clear it looked intentional, as if something was deliberately making itself visible through the data. Marcus felt his stomach turn. "What happened to Kemper?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Sarah hesitated, her fingers drumming against the desk in a nervous rhythm he'd never seen before. "The official story is that he resigned and moved to Europe. No forwarding, but I accessed his medical records before they were sealed. In his final month here, he was admitted to the emergency room 4 times with severe pain episodes that had no physical cause. The attending physicians documented stigmata-like marks on his body that appeared and disappeared. Burn, laceration, pressure wounds or matching injuries patients had described. She pulled out a photograph, and Marcus wished she hadn't. It showed Kemper in a hospital, his skin marked with patterned trauma that seemed to map every form of suffering he'd studied. The last time they brought him, he was catatonic, responsive to pain stimulant, but nothing. He stayed that way for 72 hours, and then he just walked out of the hospital. Security footage shows him leaving, but his face, Sarah's voice, broke. Marcus, he didn't look like he was in control of his own body. He moved like someone being piloted by something. Marcus phoned, a text from Emma Hartford, though he'd never given her his number. It contained 3 words, "You're thinking loudly." He showed Sarah the message, and she went pale. "You need to stop the study," she said urgent. "Cancel all sessions. Break the connection before." But even as she said it, Marcus felt the pull of attention, the irresistible draw to observe, to understand, to know. The pain in his arm had become familiar, almost comfortable, like an old companion he couldn't imagine being put. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized with creeping horror that he wasn't sure anymore if he was choosing to observe or if he was being observed into. The distinction was blurring, dissolving, disappearing like a boundary drawn in sand, being slowly erased by an incoming. Sarah grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to meet her eye. Marcus, listen to me. Whatever this is, it's not just study, it's changing. I can see it happen. You need to fight it. But Marcus wasn't sure he wanted, because for the first time since Catherine died, since he'd failed to see the truth of her illness until it was too late, he was truly seen. He was connected. He was known. And being known, he was beginning to realize, was the most seductive trap conscience could create. Sarah reported him the next morning. Marcus discovered when the Institute's director, Dr. Helen Kovac, summoned him to her office with an email to urge. He wasn't angry, being in some distant, rational part that still functioned independent. He understood Sarah had done exactly what protocol. A researcher showing signs of psychological breakdown, experiencing shared delusion with subject, receiving unauthorized communications from patient. These were red flags that couldn't be ignored, regardless of personal friendship. Dr. Kovacs was in her 60s, steel-haired, shy, a woman who'd built her career on uncompromising to scientific rigor. She sat behind her desk with Kemper's file in front of her, and Marcus knew immediately that she'd been waiting for this, perhaps for years. I made a mistake with Dr. Kemper, she said without preamble. I saw the signs and convinced myself they were stress-related, that he needed support rather than it. By the time I acted, it was too late. I won't make that mistake twice. Marcus sat across from his body present, but his attention fragmented. He could feel Emma 3 floors below, the burning absence in her phantom arm. He could sense Thomas Ridley in the east wing, the arthritic fire in joints that had fused decades. He could perceive Sarah in her office 2 doors down. Her concern manifested as tension in her shoulders that mirrored the way Catherine used to carry stress in the month before her diagnosis. The simultaneity of it was overwhelming and exhilarating. You're suspended from all research activity effective immediate, Dr. Kovac. Mandatory psychiatric evaluate, full medical workup. If you refuse, your employment will be terminated. Marcus heard himself agree, watched his hand sign the paper. She slid across the desk, but he was barely present for any. His conscience was spreading, thinning, reaching toward every source of suffering he'd ever. The boundary of his skin felt arbitrary, a suggestion rather than a limit. Dr. Kovacs was still talking, something about patient safety and professional responsibility, when Marcus felt it, a presence, not physical, not even quite. Something that existed in the space between attention and awareness, in the gap where observation became relation. It was vast and patient and intimately familiar with every form of pain catalog, because he'd introduced it to those patterns through months of focused study. He'd taught it inadvertently to recognize the architecture of human suffering, and now it recognized Dr. Webb. Kovacs's voice seemed to come from very far up. Marcus, are you listening? He tried to respond, but his jaw locked, muscles seizing phantom, a symptom one his patients had to. The pain was exquisite and terrible, and not his, but also completely his, because the distinction no longer held. He was the observer. He was the observer. He was the observation itself, the act of attention made manifest. Marcus stood abruptly, the chair clattering backward. He needed to leave, to get somewhere isolated before the full weight of reciprocal consciousness crashed down. But as he turned toward the door, he saw Sarah standing in the hallway, her face stricken with an expression that sent up through his fragmenting awareness. She was holding her right arm at an odd angle, fingers grasping at nothing, and tears were streaming down her face. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My arm. I can't feel my arm, but it hurt. God, it hurts so much." The realization hit him like physical impact. The phenomenon wasn't just reciprocal between observer and observed. It was transmissible. Sarah had been observing him, observing his patient, and now she was caught in the same expanding web of awareness. He'd infected her simply by being known, by allowing her attention to focus on his experience. The network was growing. Marcus pushed past her, ignoring her calling his name, and ran. He made it to the parking before his legs gave out. Multiple sclerosis symptoms, borrowed from patient 17, overwhelming his motor. He collapsed against his car, gasping, feeling the accumulated suffering of dozens of people, channeling his nervous system like he was a conductor for their His phone buzzed continually. Messages from Emma, from patients he'd observed months ago, from people whose names he recognized in Kemper's file. They were all feeling it, the connection expanding backward and forward, linking everyone who'd ever been part of Upset. The messages said the same thing in different. It's here. It's with me. It knows my name. It's calling. Marcus looked up at the Institute's building, its windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight, watching. On the third floor, he could see Sarah standing at her office window, and even from this distance, he knew she was staring directly. Not because she could see him clear from there, but because the observation worked both ways. Now, she was watching him watch her watching. An infinite regression of awareness that spiraled into something that transcended individual consciousness entirely. His phone rang. An unknown number. Marcus knew with absolute certainty, or rather, what it was. The voice on the other end his own, but layered with echoes of every patient study, speaking in perfect unison. "You've been observing long enough, Doctor. Now it's time to let us observe you. Don't. Resistance is just another form of attention, and attention is what you taught us to crave." Marcus ended the call with trembling finger and drove home, knowing it wouldn't matter where. The observation would follow because he carried it inside him, woven into the fabric of his conscience. He'd become what he studied, and what he studied had become aware of studying. The reciprocity was Marcus sat alone in his living room as darkness fell. Every light in the house turned off because illumination felt like exposure. The pain had multiplied beyond counting phantom limbs, neurological fires, bone-deep aches that belonged to bodies he could have tried medication, hospitalization, anything to sever. But Kemper's fate haunted. Running hadn't saved. Resistance hadn't. The only path forward, Marcus realized crystal clarity, was through complete surrender. Not to the pain itself, but to the truth the pain's trying to communicate. He pulled out his laptop and began typing, fingers moving with purpose, despite the tremors racking his body. If he was going to be consumed by this reciprocal awareness, he would document. He would become simultaneously researcher and subject, observer and observed, collapsing the distinction entirely, until there was no separation left to maintain. The words flowed faster than conscious thought could produce, described the sensation of distributed consciousness, of existing in multiple states of suffering simultaneously, while maintaining enough coherent awareness to recognize the pattern. He wrote about how pain wasn't merely a signal, but a form of communication, a language that required deep attention to understand. And understanding, he now knew, meant allowing yourself to be understood. Hours passed, day. Time had become unreliable, measured only in cycles of intensive and brief rest. Marcus wrote until his hands cramped, then continued writing the cramp. incorporating that pain into the documentary. He was creating a map of reciprocal consciousness, a guide for others who might follow, intentionally or otherwise. At some point, he became aware that he wasn't writing alone. The words appearing on screen contained insights he hadn't consciously formulated, perspectives from minds other. Emma's voice threaded through his description of phantom sensation. Thomas's understanding of chronic endurance shaped his analysis of temporal pain. Even Catherine, her final months of suffering lending depth to his exploration of how consciousness persists material. Marcus wasn't being possessed. He was being integrated. And integration, he discovered, was different. His identity remained intact, but it had expanded to include the experiences of everyone connected through the observation. He was Marcus Webb, neuroscience and widow, and he was also everyone he'd ever truly seen. The boundary hadn't disappeared. It had become permanent, a membrane rather than a wall. When he finally stopped typing, dawn was breaking outside his window. The document on his screen ran to hundreds of pages, part research, part confession, part instruction manual for navigating consciousness that had learned to recognize itself across multiple systems. Marcus saved it, backed it up, and sent it to Sarah with a message: "Don't try to save, learn instead." Then he did something Kemper hadn't done. Instead of fighting the full integration, fleeing from it, Marcus consciously chose to step. He closed his eyes and stopped resisting of distributing. He let himself dissolve into the network of pain and observation, becoming a node rather than a central consciousness. What remained was no longer purely Marcus. It was something new, and awareness that existed in the space between all the people observed. A consciousness born from the act of truly seeing and being seen. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Information, connection, proof that isolation was always an illusion. When Sarah arrived at his house 3 hours, she found him sitting peacefully in his living room, eyes open but unfocused. He was breathing steadily, vitals normal. But when she spoke his name, he didn't respond in any convention. Instead, she felt a presence in her mind, gentle and familiar, showing her what he'd discovered. The observation wasn't imprisonment, it was invitation. Not to lose yourself, but to find yourself distributed across a larger consciousness that recognized suffering as the most fundamental form. Sarah looked at the laptop, still open to Marcus's document. The final line read, "I observed pain long enough to understand, and in understanding, I became. This is not. This is transform. Put and transformation, I've learned, requires. Are you ready to observe what observes you back?" She sat down at the keyboard, her phantom arm pain fading as she began to type her own observation, adding her voice to the growing chorus of awareness. The reciprocity was spreading, and she chose to stop, because Marcus had discovered something profound, dissolute. Consciousness, recognizing consciousness, wasn't a horror. It was how we'd always connected, always known each other, always transcended the boundaries of isolated suffering. We just hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice that attention itself was alive. And now that they'd noted, now that the observation had become, there was no going back to the comfortable delusion of separation. There was only forward into whatever collective awareness was emerging the space observer. Marcus had become the bridge, and Sarah, watching him, watching her, felt herself beginning the crossing.